Hi, everyone. Before we begin, please know that today's webinar is being recorded. We would also like for you to know that we will have interpreters throughout the duration of the webinar. Today, we are pleased to have with us two interpreters, Maria Pape and Natalia Rivera. To access your preferred channel, click on the interpretation button on the toolbar, and there you can choose English or Spanish. We'd like to give a friendly reminder to all of our speakers today, to both of our speakers today, to speak clearly and slowly to give the interpreters time to interpret. Now we can get started. Happy Wednesday, everybody. I hope you're doing well and are having a wonderful day, regardless of which coast you're on or which time zone you're in. I hope you're having a wonderful day. We want to take a minute to formally welcome each of you to today's CCR ETA 2110 evaluation webinar entitled Qualitative Methods and Cultural Considerations when Working with Marginalized Communities, which is being hosted by Arizona State University's Office of Community Health, Engagement, and Resiliency, or OCHR as we call it. My name is Dr. Dana Hunter. Pronouns used are she, her, and hers. I serve as a co-investigator with ASU's OCHR team, which is led by Dr. Mary Ellen Brown, who is the founder and director of OCHR, alongside a host of experts in community-based research and evaluation and community organizing. We want to take a moment and thank the CDC CCR staff for this opportunity to share with you all the 2109 site's relevant information to assist with your projects. Today, next slide, please. Today, we have two dynamic presenters. You all are in for a treat. Two dynamic presenters who will share relevant skills and techniques to use and consider when incorporating qualitative methods into your evaluation plan. Dr. Heather Dreyfus and Leonardo Gamboa, or Leo as we call him. The first presenter, Dr. Dreyfus, is the co-founder and CEO of Impact Oriented Group. She's a digital storytelling expert and qualitative data specialist who co-designs culturally grounded capacity building programs that impact systemic change in public health research and evaluation. She's an inclusive facilitator who is honored to collaborate with teams on stakeholder-centric problem solving and in elevating marginalized voices. We're so thankful for you being with us here today, Dr. Dreyfus. And next slide, please. After Dr. Dreyfus, we will hear from one of ASU's very own, Mr. Leonardo Gamboa. I mentioned Leo. Leo is a cultural research and evaluation specialist at OCHR, which is housed within Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions at ASU. His work has helped sustain a solid basis for programming centered on diversity and cultural relevance. And if you haven't met Leo before, you're going to meet him today, and you will know why we all just love Leo. At OCHR, Leo is responsible for tailoring measures to assess the effectiveness of community-engaged prevention and intervention that promotes sustainability and integration for community health workers across the United States. Next slide, please. So, For today's webinar, we will briefly cover the following: a general overview of a few qualitative evaluation methods that are useful when working with marginalized communities. More specifically, you will learn about digital storytelling, focus groups, and skills to use when planning and designing an evaluation plan that also includes conducting key informant interviews. Both presenters will have a time of interaction and engagement with you, the participants, followed by a QA session and a brief assessment at the close of the webinar. We hope that today's webinar is beneficial to you and that you gain additional tools to use when working with individuals and CHW professionals within your respective communities. At this time, I will turn it over to Liz to go over a few remaining items before our presenters begin. Liz?
Thank you, Dana. My name is Elizabeth Hatch. I'm the training and TA lead with the ASU evaluation team. And first, I want to read this acknowledgement. Arizona State University's Office of Community Health, Engagement, and Resiliency acknowledges the 22 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. Arizona State University's 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Akmel Odom and Peeposh Indian communities, whose care and keeping of these lands allows us to be here today. Both of our presenters have created handouts for you, including an overview and worksheet on digital storytelling and focus groups, and an interview toolkit. I will share a Google Doc with a list of links to each of these resources in the chat momentarily. Please stick around for information about upcoming webinars at the end of today's presentation. Links to register for upcoming webinars will be available in that same resource Google Doc that I share with you in the chat. Lastly, please remember that AMP is where you will find information about the CCR project and where you can make TA requests for assistance with your project's evaluation, including follow-up on any of the methods that we talk about today. Here is our code of care for today's presentation. I will highlight a few important things to remember. You are welcome to introduce yourself in the chat if you have not already, and share what organization you are working with. Please use the chat or the Q&A throughout the presentation to post questions, and if possible, to whom you are asking your question. And lastly, please take care of yourself. If you need to step away for any reason, please do. A recording of today's webinar will be uploaded to AMP. And here is Dr. Heather Dreyfus to get us started.
Hello, I'm Dr. Heather Dreyfus. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm calling in from the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaki lands today. I'd like to start with a centering moment and honor where we're all coming from and the energy that it took to stop doing what you're doing to join us here today. We invite you to take a moment, settle in, and get comfortable. We'll be asking you to share ideas and participate in the webinar today. We'll start with the shared definition of qualitative evaluation. Next slide, please. So what's the value of qualitative evaluation? Please add your answers by scanning the QR code with your cell phone camera or by using the link in the chat. And we're going to have Leo share his screen so we can see a word cloud that we're going to create. So the QR code is also up in the corner. or you can go to slido.com and enter the number to enter your answer. What's the value of qualitative evaluation? Great. I'm going to read a few of these. So it gives voice to participants. Wow, that was beautiful. Depth, full picture, understanding, deeper, tells the whole story in their own words, getting unique perspective, allows voice representation. Yep. Shows areas for improvement, empathy. Yep. Perspective. We're going to go ahead and let that cloud keep populating, and we'll share it at the end as well. But yeah, that's a great start for where we're headed today. All right, next slide, please. All right, so sometimes it helps to compare qualitative methods to quantitative methods in order to round out our definition. I'm going to focus on the qualitative side, and you can look at the quantitative side on the right for comparison. When you're talking about qualitative methods, the focus is really on the meaning, the experience, the words. And the goal is really to understand, to describe, and as somebody put up there, is discover the depth, right? That's what we're looking for. And there's lots of ways to do this. You can do it through open-ended questions, interviews, focus groups, asset mapping, document review, observations, photo voice, and digital storytelling, to name just a few examples. Next slide, please. For example, we might understand that 78% of clinics appreciate the integration of community health workers, right? That 78% is the what, or the number. But we don't fully understand why or how community health workers are appreciated in that setting. We often fill the gaps in our knowledge with assumptions. One way to fill those gaps with data includes qualitative data collection that allows us to dig in and really understand people's beliefs, experiences, attitudes, behaviors, and interactions. This helps us to explain complex issues by explaining the why and how behind the numbers. Think of it as humanizing the statistics and telling a story together. Next slide, please. I'm going to share a digital story clip. This story is not mine, so I obtained permission from the author to share parts of this story for today's webinar. To make this digital storytelling process authentic, we thought a lot about power dynamics and positionality. We had high school students from the community complete a training to facilitate the creation of these digital stories. The high school students came up with the questions about barriers and assets in pursuing a public health degree. They also worked with the college students to create the digital stories. So I'm going to share my screen and see if we can get this to play.
I always wanted to be in the health field. When I was asked, what do you want to do after high school? My response was, I want to either be a pediatrician or a nurse. Then I had an opportunity to take a certified nursing assistant course as part of the dual credit program with San Juan College. After I finished my certification, I realized I didn't want to be a CNA because I didn't like the clinical setting, but I knew I wanted to be in the health field. From high school to college, I had no real strategy. I went to college for nursing right out of high school and I flunked out. I failed my second semester. I felt like college wasn't for me, and I just went on to working at different places. After a few years, I became tired of working dead-end jobs. My older brother asked me if I wanted to move to Vegas and go to school. So I agreed, and my daughter and I moved to Las Vegas, Nevada. At this point, my family was pushing me, telling me that I could and I should do more as far as my education goes. I enrolled into the College of Southern Nevada, and I came to find that it was a really different experience than San Juan College. It really pushed me. It made me feel that I had to rise up to these different expectations, especially being away from my parents. I didn't want to fail. Also, being away from the Navajo Nation and in a more Western world, I learned so much about discipline and time management. I moved back to the Navajo Nation a year and a half later and decided to get serious about my future.
So that is just a little snippet of a story that was created to give you an idea of kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And then we'll move to the next slide. So digital storytelling is a decentering and decolonizing methodology that positions the storyteller as an expert to create a narrative of their lived experiences. This really shifts the power from the researcher to community members. It's the researcher's turn to step back, to step down, to be humble, to listen, and learn from community members. This method elevates community voice and it honors the validity of storytelling as data. Digital storytelling integrates participants' voices through a hands-on workshop model. First, we'll start by writing and recording a script, gathering existing images or taking images and videos, and it results in a 3 to 5 minute digital narrative engaging others in a given topic. It can also be used as an intervention or advocacy tool. Next slide, please. So when to use digital storytelling, and as we were populating the word cloud, elevating community member voices is going to be key. And what you need is consent to create the story, consent to share the story. We'll talk about more elements of consent as we go. It's also helpful to have a digital storyteller facilitator from the community so you can get good data. You'll need access to a smartphone or iPad or a computer. It can be Mac or PC. Then we'll talk about editing platforms where you put the story together. And you'll also need media, so visual evidence that's supporting the story. Next slide. So this is the digital storytelling process. First is the story development. And in this context, we'll use an evaluation question to help shape the storytelling process. And then the story development, there's 2 ways to go about it. First, there's a free script. We'll share an example of that. And then there's something called a digital storytelling guide. I'll talk about that as well. Then the second step is drafting that script, which is the audio aspect of the story that you heard. The third step is a story circle, which is a chance to share and gain feedback about what you've written. And it's also a good chance to edit and revise the script from feedback. Then step 4, record the story. Step 5, collect media, so pictures, videos, evidence that supports the story. Step 6, assemble the story on an editing platform. And step 7 is the best part, sharing the story. Next slide, please. And then we'll go through this process step by step. So for story development, this is an example of the free script where the participant writes the whole story pretty much on their own. So I just chose this question. It is from the CCR performance measures. It's the partnership evaluation question. To what extent have the enhanced CHW training program efforts increased the skills, capacities, competencies, of CHWs to provide health education and support for COVID-19 response efforts among priority populations. So first, you need to think about whose perspective or whose voice should be heard for this question. And right here, I did highlight CHWs for this one. And then what are the key words? We've got skills, capacities, competencies, health education, and support. So then from there, you can think of an overarching prompt. And this is, think of a time when the training you received increased your skills to provide health education and support to your community around COVID-19. It's pretty open-ended and lets the participant take the story on and make it their own. If you're a CHW, this would be a good question to use to learn digital storytelling and try it yourself to get more comfortable. Next slide, please. So this example, we'll talk about a digital storytelling guide, which is a little bit more specific than the open framework. So this question is from the performance measures. It's deploy, I think it's IR5. And this is measure the number and types of vaccine deployment plans in which CHWs are included in the planning, design, deployment of plan components, ethical distribution of initial COVID-19 vaccine supplies to vaccine providers in accordance with state, local, tribal, and federal regulations, and or dissemination to identified individuals or populations. So with this, the first question is the same. Whose voice or perspective should be heard for this? And I want you to go ahead and read the question again, and in the chat, put whose voice or perspective we should be looking at for this one. I'm going to open up the chat. Right. So in this one, we are looking for the CHW's voice to be heard. Yep, there we go. And the keywords are highlighted again. You've got vaccine deployment, planning, design, deployment, ethical distribution, and dissemination. And then if you, can you go ahead and go to the next slide, please? Yeah. Oh, thank you. Even more residents, health officials. All right, so I left the performance measure at the top just for reference. So to start us off, we thought of an overarching question, right? So to make it more specific, think of a vaccine deployment plan, mobile vaccination effort, pop-up clinic, standing clinic, or some other type of vaccine dissemination effort. And if you're using a specific cultural framework or a theory to drive the evaluation, use the framework or theory to help you write these guiding questions. So this is where I'm going to have you think for a minute, and then I'm going to ask you to jot something down in the chat. But take a minute and looking at this overarching question of thinking about a specific vaccine deployment plan, write down a few questions to help dig a bit deeper into this experience. What else would you want to know? What else would be helpful to know about this experience? And then go ahead and type it in the chat. What are questions you would want to know about this? That get at the planning, design, and distribution. I see things coming through the chat, the age group, right? So what's the age group? Who this is? Quotes from people who are helped. how CHWs were involved, locate and focus areas that are lesser served. What time frame was this? For you as a CHW, in what ways were your vaccine deployment plan successful? Yep. The role of the CHW, what was their part of the process? What partners were involved? Yep. These are great questions. So you guys are all on the right track. You just want to really pull out kind of those, getting to that depth of this experience and kind of painting a picture of what's actually happening. All right, next slide, please. Thank you for your participation. So we've gone over the first one, step one, right? The story development, just picking a question. And then the second part of story development, either the free script or the digital storytelling guide. So you have that overarching question, then a series of questions to get deeper. And what you really want to do, if you have the guide, you want to make sure that you test it. So you're going to test the digital storytelling guide with 1 to 2 community health workers who are not going to be doing the digital story. You want to ask them to check if the language is culturally appropriate. Is it easy to understand? Are there any questions or points of clarity? And then edit the guide based on their feedback. Okay, next slide, please. So step 2 is draft a script. The script is about 250 to 300 words. So if you are a visual learner, it's about half a page. So it's really not that long. And in the beginning, you'll set up the story to give the viewer a sense of what your story is about and why it's important. In the middle, if it's the free prompt, we'll be answering that. And if it's the digital storytelling guide, they'll be answering the series of questions here in the middle. Then in the end, connect the story with how you set it up in the beginning. And sometimes if the storyteller has a writer's block, a good tip is to ask someone to sit across from the storyteller while they share the story. And you can have that other person ask the storyteller questions to help elaborate on their story. Next slide, please. So a story circle, step 3, sharing the story out loud helps you get a feel for how it will sound. So you can get feedback for clarity and flow of the story. You learn from each other. And this is also a good opportunity to edit and revise the script before you record it. Next slide, please. For step 4, you choose an editing platform and record the script. I'm going to focus on WeVideo today because it's free and the most accessible. It's available on a PC, on a Mac, iPad, iPhone, or Android. Next slide, please. So you can go to wevideo.com and use your email to log in and create a password. Then to start a new digital story, you click on Create New and choose Full Featured Editor, just right over here. Next slide, please. And then for step 5, you want to collect media, so photos, videos, maybe some ambient sound or music. First, you want to obtain permission if the photos are of people, and you can do that through a basic media release form, saying that you can use that photo and share that with other people. You can also take photos or videos without faces showing, and sometimes that's more culturally appropriate. This group didn't want their faces showing, so this is an example where they're facing away from the camera, but still allowed that photo to happen. Then use the photos that support the story. This could be pictures of people, it could be pictures of documents, it depends on the story you're telling. There are also visuals from the internet. These are considered public domain sites, so they're not copyrighted at all. One common one is search.creativecommons.org, and there you can actually search different pictures or photos that you're looking for. Next slide, please. So for step 6, you assemble and share the story. When you import photos and videos into the photo library with WeVideo, you just press the import button, or you can drag and drop in here, and they will show up in here. Then you can also use the narrate function right here to record the story. And it's a little confusing, but you want to use the narrate part to record the story. And then the audio track will come up at the very bottom under audio 1, and that becomes your soundtrack. And then you can pull pictures into video 1, and that becomes the visual part. You can add music or titles or transitions into the video. And then you can also preview it right here. This is the preview screen to the right. And you can press the play button and it will preview everything you have so far. When the story is complete, press finish and export the story. That way you can share it on different platforms. All right, next slide, please. So we all have multiple unknown dimensions that we bring to the table in this work. You should start by identifying your positionality, your social location, how you fit into the group, how you don't fit into the group, the power dynamics between the evaluation team and the people you'll be using these qualitative methods with. This also frames how questions are asked and the approach to recruitment. Some considerations, as mentioned before, did you layer in cultural frameworks? What are the power dynamics? Whose voice needs to be heard in this? Is it your personal reflection or someone else's? How do you honor the story if it's not yours? So kind of going back to the beginning when I introduced that it wasn't my story and was very clear about that. Did you obtain consent to use pictures, videos, voices of the people? Did you obtain consent to share the story? And then a note about artistic freedom. The audio and the images don't have to match exactly. So you can use that piece to get pretty creative. I'm going to take a minute to pause. If there are questions about digital stories, take a moment to write them in the Q&A. We will have a Q&A at the end of the session. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time to do that before we jump into focus groups. So if there are any questions about digital stories, go ahead and write them in the Q&A. And then when you're ready, next slide. Thank you. So focus groups. When we think about focus groups, it's more of a group interview with 6 to 12 participants. And they're about an hour to an hour and a half. And the purpose for a group interview or focus group is to really get more information about perceptions, insights, attitudes, experiences, or beliefs. And the fun part about focus groups is you are really looking to capture that interaction between participants. So it becomes a community conversation. And the point of the focus group is focusing on the group dynamics. How are people interacting together? And that can be pretty powerful. Next slide, please. So what you need for a focus group, you'll need consent to record, and it may or may not be culturally appropriate to record. So we'll talk about that too. You'll need a focus group guide, which is similar to the digital storytelling guide. There are specific roles for conducting a focus group, and we'll cover that. You'll need to think about recruiting participants. And then if you're in person, it's really helpful to have something for the participants to write ideas down, as multiple people might be speaking. And then if it's online, having a visual of the question can be helpful, so people can be looking at it and thinking about their answer. Next slide, please. Okay. So the first 4 slides focus on the preparation for the focus group. So the first step is to co-construct a focus group guide based on performance measures, kind of like we did with digital storytelling. Then you'll test the focus group guide. Step 3, secure a place, date, and time. Step 4, recruit participants. Step 5, conduct focus groups. Step 6, transcribe the audio, which will end up being notes. And then step 7, analyze those transcripts. Next slide, please. All right, so the first step in this focus group process, we'll start with an internal meeting with the evaluation team and the stakeholders. You'll want to choose an evaluation question. Then based on the question, determine who to recruit for the focus groups. And then with the stakeholder and evaluation team, you'll co-construct the focus group guide. This question is part of the CCR performance measure from Deploy, the process evaluation question. And the question is, how are partners at community-based organizations where community health workers are integrated responding to the community health workers' presence in their organizations? Take a minute to read the question. And then in the chat, who should be invited to this focus group? What are your thoughts on that? Our partners at community-based organizations where CHWs are integrated, responding to the CHW presence in their organization. Who is the audience we should be inviting to the focus group? Great. Great, thanks for those of you participating. I see some answers coming in. We've got patients, partners, non-community health worker organization staff, so social workers, clinicians. Yep. You've got faith-based groups, maybe a clinic, different providers. That's definitely the right track. So anyone that fits that community-based organization, that's the people that you're going to want to have as part of the focus group. And then with this, you'll include other questions that pertain to community partners' perspectives. And Leonardo will discuss these questions in more detail. So I'll have him go into that some more. And once again, if you're using a theory or cultural framework to guide the evaluation, this is a good time to pull those up and have that framework or theory guide your questions as well. Next slide, please. So in the internal meeting, once you have that focus group guide prepared, you want to test it with stakeholders. So you have 2 to 3 community partners that are not going to take part in the focus group. Test the guide for language use. Is it easy to understand? Is the cultural context appropriate? Is it clear? And then edit and revise the questions based on the feedback you get. For step 3 for the focus group process, whether it's online or in person, you want to secure a specific date and time. You want to match the availability of the group. Some groups are already meeting at certain times. If you can slip into one of those meetings, that would be a really good way to do it. You need to take cultural practices into account. Some groups don't meet during certain times or certain days, so being aware of that. If you're meeting in person, you want to make sure it's a neutral location to the topic and the group. So if you're meeting community partners, maybe you don't want to meet at one of their organizations. You might want to meet in a common space. Next slide, please. Step 4 is recruiting participants. First, you want to think about who, right? And with this question, specifically from the partner organizations, who should be invited? You want to think through power dynamics. You want to think about people being in similar roles. That way there's not hierarchy. You also want to have a more homogeneous group. And then you want to think about how to recruit participants. What's the best way to reach out to community partners? How are you already reaching out to these community partners? And can you use those existing lines of communication? There are also ways of word of mouth, local radio, social media. It depends on the community you're working with and what will work for recruitment. Step 5, conducting the focus group. For the specific roles, we'll talk about the facilitator's role. So the facilitator's role is to really connect with participants and actively listen. They're not judging answers. They're literally just listening and collecting data. It's the facilitator's role to keep the conversation moving and on topic and invite all participants to contribute. Then the note taker is an observer. They don't really interact with the group. If it's in person, they're typically off to a corner. The note should include a map of participants if it's in person, so you can see where people were sitting, because sometimes where they're sitting or who they're sitting next to influences what's happening. You want to have a sense of what each person said and identify how comments were said, kind of what's the emotion behind the word, and record nonverbal communication that can tell you a lot. So recording body language, sighs, laughter. And then the recorder is solely responsible for recording the focus group. And that recording will be used to create a transcript of the focus group. Next slide, please. All right, some considerations. So as I said before, for the facilitator, you'll want a trusted community member. You'll get a lot better, more in-depth information if you're having the facilitator be someone from the community that they trust. You want to make sure the facilitator is a good listener and that they're non-judgmental. Then for the questions for the focus group guide, you want to make sure they're culturally aligned and there's third-person phrasing. And what I mean by that is instead of, what do you think about community health worker integration? You can ask, what do community-based organizations think of community health worker integration? It kind of separates it and makes it less personal, and you tend to get more informed answers that way. So with recording in small communities specifically, some people are worried about voice recognition, so they may or may not grant you permission to record. If you do get permission, great, you're all set. If you don't have permission, you want to have at least 2 note takers present. And then after the focus groups, the note takers will compare notes and compile them into one document. Next slide, please. So a little bit about, I'll look at the chat in a second, a little bit about confidentiality. You want to reassure that the data is de-identified. Okay, you're going to be reporting this information in aggregate, not in individual responses. And then another cultural consideration. So you want to have enough time for introductions. In some cultures, this is a pretty big deal and it will take up a fair amount of time. So make sure you're budgeting time for that. You also want to make sure, think about, do we need to translate the questions before we're talking with community members? What language do they need to have the questions in? And then along with that, do you need to have interpreters present at the focus group, whether it's online or in person, to make sure you have these steps thought through? Yes, so I'm reading the chat too. It's also saying introducing the facilitator, note taker, and recorder roles. So people from the community kind of understand what's going on. So it builds more trust. Yes, spot on. Thank you. So Leonardo is going to be going over more specifics for interviews that also apply to focus groups, which are group interviews. He will cover the understanding of your own biases as you develop questions. He'll cover the type of questions and how to end the focus group and interview sessions. Leo, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, for the insightful introduction to qualitative evaluation. For my piece, I will focus on the essential elements as described by Heather for planning and practicing the actual interview. And we hope that this will help you as you consider adopting these qualitative strategies that we presented for you earlier. Thank you, Heather. Next slide, please. Today, I'll go over the value of interviews, specifically when it comes to historically excluded populations, the importance of self-reflection, sample plan, interview structure, and questions. Next slide. So I invite people, before I define qualitative interviews specifically, I invite a couple of people to share in the chat any experiences they have doing or conducting interviews. And I'll read 2 or 3 comments. And I just want to understand y'all's experiences. So what experience do you have conducting interviews, if at all? Okay, I see comments in the chat. Surveys that include open-ended questions usually need an icebreaker. Interviews of nursing home residents related to rights, etc. Yeah, so open-ended is key here. Assessment, awesome. Relationship first, I love that. Awesome. Okay. Well, in qualitative research, we think of interviews as guided question and answer conversations. Another way to define interviews is by thinking of them as an exchange of views and values between 2 persons or groups of people conversing about a theme or a specific topic. And I always advise people to consider the role of interviews in their line of work because they reveal essential, actionable items that just regular conversations or work meetings typically don't explore. And the interviews I address for this webinar require a fair amount of planning and thinking and are considered more evaluation focused. And they're definitely about building relationships. So I see a lot of themes here in the chat. So thank you all. Next slide. The biggest takeaway of interviews is that they provide opportunities for mutual discovery. Again, this piece of relationship. What do I mean by mutual discovery? Well, they help us explore first-person perspectives about real-life experiences together. Interviews are kind of like night vision goggles. Because they allow us to see in the night, they allow us to see the unseen. Interviews allow us to explore complex, unseen topics. This is because interviews provide accounts of people's stories, motivations, best practices, or how they uniquely resolved an organizational challenge as a CHW. Therefore, we can think of interviews as getting closer to the heart of the matter because they help us understand more about what we found in our surveys. And lastly, we have to be cognizant of our audience. And so that includes being careful, conscious, and respectful about people's subject positions. Next slide. All interviews are about making sense of the world together, right? That relationship piece is key. And so we must be mindful of how our presence as interviewers can impact the comfort of the people we plan to interview. And we all have a subject position, meaning we all have unique ways of working with our communities that are influenced by our professional training or even our social backgrounds. Next slide. And so we invite you to consider your subject positions. We all impact how people talk to us about their life, their work, their memories, the past. We invite you to become a self-reflexive interviewer so that you can engage the interview process with more respect and self-awareness. The following questions have been designed to help you think more critically about how you can be more of an inclusive interviewer. And so the questions are the ones that are listed on the slide. Write down, feel free to work on this at this time. And these questions will also be included in the interview how-to toolkit to help you think through what it means to be self-reflexive. So you can write down obvious physical traits or demographics that your participants might see during the interview. You can reflect and write about the qualities or characteristics of yourself and your conversational style that will become visible during the interview process. And finally, how do you foresee these traits and qualities impacting and influencing the interview process and the relationship piece of interviews, which is so important? And so I invite a couple of folks to, if they're comfortable, to share some of their answers to maybe question 1, 2, or 3, just to help us think and reflect more on what it means to be a self-reflexive interviewer. I see in the chat asking open-ended questions that will help you promote the conversation to flow. Dressing, yeah, dressing is important. Maybe overdressing in some cultures might seem out of place, or maybe it's about that relaxed, comfortable attitude sometimes. Or maybe wearing something that identifies your organization so that during the interview, that person can identify you as someone who can provide comfort and that professionalism. Transparency, the tone of your voice, absolutely. Yeah, great stuff. So next slide. Thank you all for participating. So the sample plan. Now that we've discussed self-reflection, let's talk about who we want to interview. A sample plan is just a fancy word for a recruitment design. And so in thinking about how to determine the best people to interview, one must be aware of where we're located and how we can reach out to participants given location constraints. We must also consider the best time to reach out to our population. For example, if we want to interview CHWs, what is the best way to reach out to CHWs that doesn't add extra labor on their part? Finally, in qualitative research, we use all kinds of sampling plans. But for this webinar, we're going to recommend purposeful sampling. So let's go. Next slide. In purposeful sampling, you set out to identify members of the population who are likely to possess specific characteristics or experiences, and these people are willing to share those experiences with you. This way, you can select the individuals that fit your study, focusing on a relatively smaller sample. We can select unique individuals to interview based on our performance measures that appear on the slide. And in the following slides, I'll show you a way in which you can do that. So next slide, please. I randomly selected one of the performance measures for this exercise. This performance measure lists CB3 from our guiding document. It outlines how organizations can track an increased workforce for CHWs, I looked at the list of data sources for tracking workforce increases to determine a sampling strategy for my interviews. And I highlighted this information in yellow. And in the next slide, I break it down. Next slide, please. By looking at this data source, I developed a list of guiding questions to help me think of specific organizations or groups of people that can help me learn more about CB3 or workforce increases for CHWs. I typed some guiding questions to help me determine a sample population who can help me recruit for my interviews or who are willing to be interviewed. And the guiding questions appear in blue on the slide. Next slide, please. So interview structure. It'll depend on your evaluation question. Structure just means the organization of or flow of the questions that we plan to ask for interviews or group interviews or focus groups. I have a way to imagine the structure is to think of the list of questions appearing on paper. And so we have two structures. Next slide. I just wanted to briefly talk about structured interviews, and they use something we call an interview schedule. They're super helpful when we have big teams of evaluators and we need everything to be scripted. But for our purpose, we want to focus more on semi-structured interviews. Next slide. A semi-structured interview is more flexible, and this conversation uses an interview guide. Interview guides are perfect for these types of interviews because they are more about probing and allowing the interviewee to explore topics as they unfold naturally through conversation. I review the interview guide specifically and all those strategies in our how-to toolkit that will be available to you after the webinar. Next slide. So here's where things get more technical. So earlier I mentioned how the structure depends on the evaluation question. We don't want to ask the actual evaluation question during our interviews. It's better to be more strategic and break down the evaluation question into chunks so that our interviews run more smoothly. And this diagram shows how a hypothetical evaluation question can be used to develop strategic interview questions, which are easier to answer. Next slide, please. So what makes a great interview question? A culturally relevant interview questions. So here it goes. The questions should be simple and clear. They should not be double-barreled, so meaning you shouldn't ask 1,000 things in one question, one thing at a time. They should be open-ended because that builds relationship. They shouldn't be yes or no questions. They should be questions that require the flexibility of an answer. However, the questions should also be neutral, non-leading, and straightforward. The questions should be worded using neutral language that doesn't feel personal or abrasive. Great interview questions uphold rather than threaten the identities of the people we plan to interview. We want to honor people's pronouns. We want to honor their identity. We want to honor their roles or their titles in an organization, and we should adapt our language and our questions and even our language if we need interpreters in order to uphold identities. Meaning the questions could be translated into different languages, and maybe interviewers should also accommodate to language needs. Lastly, great interview questions use probes and follow-ups. We don't want to assume anything. The person being interviewed is the expert. And so we want to ask as many follow-ups to gain all the clarification and all the examples so that we can paint that picture for our evaluations. Next slide. Now, what makes a great what we talked about what makes a great interview question. Now there's different types. There's open, non-direct, direct, and closing. And I want to go over these very briefly. So next slide. These are at the beginning of the interview or focus group. An example of a great opening question would be, when did you decide to become a CHW? This helps build relationship and set the stage for the interview. And they open up the floor to tell those stories. Next slide. A great example of a non-direct question would be, can you describe a typical day at the office or organization? This question is neutral, non-threatening, and it gives power to the interviewee to explain their answer at their own pace using their own words. And these types of questions can also elicit deeper context, and so it makes the interviewee feel like an expert. Next slide. Direct questions is where we take some of that power back, but in a respectful way. An example of a direct question would be, what do you think about how this organization describes itself? We are now directing the conversation to particular subjects or topics related to our evaluation. So that's how we take the power back in a respectful way. Next slide. An example of a closing question would be, is there anything you wish people knew about your role that you haven't told me already? This type of question leaves the interviewee feeling like an expert. And this is also the perfect time to also ask things about using pseudonyms to protect people's identity or for confidentiality purposes. Next slide. Now I will briefly discuss some best practices or tips for one-on-one interviews and focus groups. So what makes a good interview and a good interviewer? Very quickly. Next slide. What makes a good interview? I'd like you to think about the best place for interviews or focus groups as a space that's accessible to everyone. And that's going to be different for different people. Believe it or not, I have conducted an entire study using Zoom because it offered equitable access for a group of people to discuss openly about their private lives. And Zoom is a great culturally relevant alternative to face-to-face because it's cost-effective, self-transcribing, provides safety and boundaries, and therefore encourages participation. And the self-transcribing piece is just great. Just ensure that you enable the live transcription, and it's fantastic. So we recommend it. We see it as valuable. Next slide. In no particular order, here are the takeaways for a good interviewer for culturally relevant interviewing. Here we go. A good interviewer is knowledgeable about the population. Oh, and I see a question. I will get to it in the chat. A good interviewer is gentle and forgiving, allowing interviewees to pace and respond the way they desire and providing smooth transitions. A good interviewer is sensitive, paying attention to the emotional tone or the nuances in the voices and gestures of the interviewee. A good interviewer is open-minded and not quick to judge, verbally or non-verbally. A good interviewer is probing, does not take everything at face value, and just keeps asking for clarification. A good interviewer is attentive, listening and referencing earlier answers. A good interviewer also interprets, clarifies, and extends answers by following up. And a good interviewer is engages in member checking, which is when you allow the interviewee to provide their feedback on their answers. Even during the transcription, you can invite key members of the population that you want to interview to help you guide and interpret things further. So it's about being invitational. Next slide for my wrap up. So we hope this section helped you understand the essential elements of developing an interview and a focus group guide, and that these tips help you. And now I'd like to take some time to just briefly go over our Slido word cloud progress, because it's looking awesome. So Elizabeth, can I please have access to share my screen? Okay. Let me know if you can see.
Looks good.
Thank you so much. So yeah, the nuance piece, I think it's fantastic. I love that word. Understanding, depth, full picture. Heather, I invite you to also share some comments too about our Slido progress, or anyone in the chat too also.
I say I feel like that's been captured really well, the value of qualitative evaluation. Richer data, depth.
And we'll make sure to have this Slido progress included in our handouts so that you can remember us and remember the space of knowledge that we've built together with this word cloud. So for the sake of time, I'll stop sharing, but I invite you to continue to discuss this topic in the chat. And yeah, I'll pass the baton over to Elizabeth Hatch, who will lead our Q&A. There's a question in the chat that I will answer during our Q&A. I'll take note of it. And so thank you all for listening. I really appreciate you all. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you to both of our presenters for putting this together. I will open the floor to questions. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A if you haven't already. And Leo, if you want to get us started, I believe this was geared towards you. Doesn't Zoom also have a translation app?
It can be plugged in. One of the things that it depends on if Zoom is free for your organization. It might not be as sophisticated, but you can get apps that will plug into Zoom to help you translate, like Otter. Just to ensure that when it's transcribing, that it transcribes to the language that the Zoom has been set to do, to kind of operate. So if you use Zoom in Mexico and it's in Spanish, then it'll transcribe in Spanish. But if you use Zoom geographically in the United States and you're conducting an interview in Spanish, then it's going to have difficulties transcribing that. So translation may not be automatic in that way, but there are plugins that you can add onto Zoom, or you can submit for it to be translated. I know that Otter is a service that you can hire. And so I hope that answered your question. Heather, feel free to jump in if there's some information that I don't know.
No, I think you covered it very well.
Thank you so much, Antoinette. Thank you.
Okay, and we have another question, and I believe this came in, Heather, when you were presenting. Could you give us some common examples of how to honor stories that are not ours?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, in the example you saw, the college student wrote the script and recorded it, but she did not put the story together. It was actually a high school student who put the story together. And we were really careful to make sure that the pictures and videos that were used were okayed by the actual author. So the high school student kind of put things together, and it created this beautiful dialogue between the high school student and the college student. And they kept going back and forth to make sure, it's kind of like the member check with interviewing, but you're making sure that the story is accurate. and yet you're telling the person's accurate story. So if it's not yours, keep having that dialogue open and make sure that the person is pretty happy with the story before you share it. So that's one way.
Thank you, Heather. And we have another question that came in through the chat. Our program wants to conduct a focus group of residents regarding existing attitudes towards the COVID vaccination and boosters. Is it appropriate to use CHWs to fulfill the roles of facilitator and note taker?
Yeah, so I think as long as the CHW is part of the group of residents, if they're familiar with the group of residents, that would be helpful. But yeah, you could have the CHWs to fill the role of facilitator and note taker. Leo, would you like to add anything to that?
Absolutely. I think it's a great idea. I would also be mindful of if this would be during times where the CHW can be compensated for their work. And secondly, it's that piece of member checking and accuracy. If the CHW shares the cultural identity or shares the experiences of the people you plan to interview for your focus groups, then they're an asset because they're experts in this life. And they can provide insights that us as evaluators from the outside may not know. So yeah, I agree with Heather.
Okay, thank you. All right, and I don't see any more questions, but I did have another question if no one else submits any. Regarding digital storytelling, for a team that has never used this approach before, what should our timeline look like if we plan to complete a digital storytelling project?
Yeah, so it depends on the team. I've done it where it can take up to a 3-day training or a 3-hour training. So it depends on how willing you are to learn the material and practice it. But a lot of it is just going in there and kind of playing with it and getting comfortable with it. And once you're comfortable with it, the actual process flows pretty quickly. So once again, it kind of comes back to your organization, level of comfort, and how much time you want to put into it. But it can be done in a shorter time frame or a longer one, depending on what works for you and your team.
Thanks. And we had a follow-up question. When you are talking about focus groups to Spanish speakers, do you have a standardized way to say focus group? And they provided some explanations, and it looks like Leo, you answered that. Was there any like further clarification to provide on that?
Yes. So Spanish is nuanced. And so within a Latin American context, in Latin American programs, the popular term is Grupo de Enfoque because that appears in the literature. But for programmatic purposes, I see value in both Grupo de Enfoque and Grupo Focal. But really, that's just if you were planning to reach out to Spanish-only speaking people who may be coming from specifically Latin America. But they're both perfectly fine.
All right, and we have another question. Shouldn't we always ensure we share an approximate of when we can share the product of the qualitative focus group? And I think for the product, are you, feel free to come off mute or stay in the chat, but I think you're talking about the results of the focus group. And Leo, while we wait for some clarification, I'd have a last question for you. If someone is using interviews in their evaluation, how do they know if the sample size is sufficient?
That's a really good question. So, because this is not statistics, we're not trying to generalize findings. We're trying to paint a picture. So my answer to that is the group representative of the population in a diverse way? The people that have been selected to be interviewed, do they represent the scope of diversity of the program? So that's the first check mark. The second is roughly we give estimates of 25 as being a good number. But at the same time, let's say that you recruited 10 interviews and there's still a lot of unanswered questions, even after looking at all those interviews. So it's really about reaching a point of saturation where you feel like there's consensus across the interviewees. That's when it's a good time to stop recruitment. And recruitment can happen even as you continue to do interviews. And so typically those are the two check marks. Heather, is there anything that that is valuable that I may have not shared?
No, I think you're spot on with that. I know there's a couple more questions coming in.
Yeah, I can read this next question about how to share the results with those you interview or conduct focus groups with. Are you aware of resources on how to present key findings, especially when individuals may not have time to commit to another meeting or their work commitments do not allow them to attend these meetings?
I can talk about that a little bit. Some communities I've worked with and we've done focus groups, we do make a point to come back to the community, whether it's at a community meeting or if it's with the organization that we're working with, we will come back and present that information to the community so they are aware. One fun example, I was working with youth at a radio station and they really wanted to present kind of the final qualitative aspect on the radio. So that was a really unique way to do it. But you can get pretty creative with how you do that. Leo, would you like to add to that?
Love everything Heather presented. But for example, my background now is with program. So how do we share quickly with our program community, with our evaluators, CHRs, POs? One of the best ways to do that is through something that is very similar to like a business summary, where you just provide a detailed summary with bullets per question in the interview guide. That way, the people who are overseeing the grant can look at the actionable items and make strategic decisions. So that's one way of breaking down the complex information into something that's easier to read for program purposes.
All right, thank you all so much. For the sake of time, I will wrap up, but I will be sharing my contact information in the last slide at the end, and you are welcome to send me any questions that maybe we didn't answer today, or if you think of any later, go ahead and send them over. Okay. And we want to extend a special thanks to ASU's Office of Community Health Engagement and Resiliency, directed by Dr. Mary Ellen Brown, the CDC CCR staff and partners for their support and assistance with promotions and marketing, and each of our speakers and staff members who assisted with making today's webinar possible. And now we want to share some of our upcoming opportunities to attend webinars from our partners, as well as our next webinar. Envision Equity will be hosting a conversation on community resilience on May 25th. And here is the link to the resource doc that has the handouts and registration links. And our partners, WASEP, will have a session on leading with community voice on June 14th. The link is also in that resource doc. And lastly, our next webinar will be held on July 12th, where we will cover best practices in data management and security. and you are welcome to sign up for that one. We want to acknowledge that this presentation was supported by a cooperative agreement with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. The contents are solely the responsibility of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the official views of the CDC.